everybody. Welcome to Futures Forward, our little webinar series hosted by the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Executive Education, Singapore Futures. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. This is episode 4, which is on how to institutionalize futures in public service. We still see people streaming in, and as we are waiting for people to kind of get settled, if in the chat you can tell us, actually, where are you joining us from? Who are you and where are you joining us from? We always get a really great diversity of attendees at these sessions. So to also understand a little bit about you, that would be really wonderful. So maybe we'll give that a couple of seconds, and if you can type in the chat where you're joining us from, that would be wonderful. Oh, hi, Brunei, fantastic. And our wonderful supporters always from Phil Futures, Philippines, always a lot of people from there, Thailand, wonderful. Oh, Ireland, fantastic. Hi, Eva. You know Eva. Yeah, Oman, New Zealand, Portugal. Oh, hi, Daniel. Great. So wonderful to see everybody joining us from all over. It's really, really great. And thank you so much for your support. We love hosting these conversations, and it means so much to us, to also, have you join us and be part of these conversations as well. So maybe as people are still kind of introducing themselves and telling us where they're from, maybe I'll introduce myself as well. Hi, everybody. My name is Cheryl Chung, and I'm the Program Director of Executive Education Singapore Futures here at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. So we're so excited to welcome you to the, it's now 4th episode in our webinar series called Futures Forward. And, it's so good to see all our many friends, colleagues in attendance today. So at Executive Education, we work a lot with individuals and organizations in the public policy space, to try to address their training and consulting needs. And this year, we've really been trying to work on building up our futures practice. So we launched this series to really have discussions about what are the policy applications of futures thinking, over the last few months, and as this year's progressed, we've really been seeing this thriving community of thinkers, practitioners, sharing their ideas and experiences in the world, and really wonderful to have another conversation today. So when we were picking the topic, about institutionalizing futures in the public service, I think one question I asked myself is thinking about the future and preparing for the future the responsibility of government? It sounds like a trick question. But actually, not every government takes this responsibility seriously. And if we do believe that this capacity, right, this ability to think about and prepare for the future is actually a mission critical one for public services all around the world, then maybe one question we should ask ourselves is, how do we institutionalize this function, right? And I think today we're really hoping to discuss, what works, what doesn't work so well, and share a little bit of, I'm going to say, real life, kind of, I'm going to say war stories, but kind of real life examples of how this works in practice. While we're a university-based program, and sometimes in the feedback we are asked to teach more with slides. I think that's not the tone of the conversation we want to have today. I think what we want to, we don't want to talk about what you read in the textbook, right? We want to talk about what did you do on Monday and how did you make this stuff work? So that's really where we are coming from. Yeah. So I think I always think about futures work a little bit like how I think about design or designers, in that anyone can call themselves a designer, just as anybody can call themselves a futurist. But to be an exceptional designer, you do need to have done the work, and you do need a great portfolio. So this brings me to our wonderful group of panelists today, who I think between the three of them have a really wonderful portfolio between them, and I think really looking forward to this conversation. So I'll just go in the order that's on the screen. So first, we've got Dr. Polchar, who is the Foresight lead at OECD, the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation. He'll share a little bit more about a more international perspective. we do have Rushdi Abdul Rahim, who is the Senior Vice President of Malaysian Industry Government Group for High Technology, doing foresight work in a wide range of projects for the Malaysian government. So welcome. And then last but definitely not least, we have Sharmini Johnson, who is the lead strategist for Futures in a new Futures team at our Ministry of Communications and Information here in Singapore. Yeah. So a few housekeeping points. You know, all these, in my ideal state of the world, we will all be in the same room and this would be a little bit more straightforward, but just to have a few housekeeping. So the first half of the session, we will hear a little bit from our three panelists, and then the next half, I'd really like to open it up to the floor for questions. Our experience from the previous sessions has been, the questions have always been really great, so please keep them coming. You can put the questions into the Q&A function. So there is a Q&A function if you explore the Zoom webinar function here, and if you can state your name and organization as well as your question, that would be wonderful. The chat is also open for comments, so please feel free to use that as well. Okay, everybody ready? Actually, I can't tell if you're ready because I can't see anyone other than the panelists, but it's okay. So if everyone, let's get started. So the first person I have, I'm going to go in a slightly different order from the screenshot before. I'm actually going to start with Sharmini. So Sharmini is the lead strategist for Futures. And then, like as I mentioned earlier, it's a new team, at the Ministry of Communication and Information in Singapore. And, prior to joining this particular team, she was also the lead strategist at the Ministry of Trade and Industries Futures and Strategic Planning Unit, where I used to work actually, which is really wonderful to also see a colleague, although separated by time and space. So that's been really fantastic. And Sharmini, it's been a real delight to actually work with, some of your colleagues, for our recent Futures Masterclass as well. So that's also been really lovely to be in touch. So Sharmini, if you don't mind, if you can introduce yourself, your work at MCI, maybe a bit about what you used to do at MTI, what this institutionalizing futures from your particular perspective looks like, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Hi, everyone. And thanks, Cheryl, for inviting me to the panel. Very happy to be here. Very glad to be here. So as Cheryl mentioned, I'm currently at the Ministry of Communications and Information. And for our international colleagues, that's essentially the ministry that oversees our digital strategies. In my role in the Ministry of Trade and Industry, the Trade and Industry Ministry oversees our economic strategies. So the work has been fairly similar, but significantly different in a way too. I do have to say that the work in terms of institutionalizing futures within MCI, we are dealing with very rapid cycles of technology, of disruption. And of course, in the economic ministry, it's not that it's any less hectic, but I think there's a slightly longer time frame in terms of how we deal with some issues. And, certain issues came up along the way that, like, for example, social issues, and then the pandemic came along, and then we really had to reevaluate what we were doing. So in terms of institutionalizing foresight in both MTI and MCI, the approach was similar, but slightly different, simply because the kinds of issues that you're dealing with and the impact and implications of those issues are very, very different. So for example, in MCI, the kinds of issues we deal with are things like what's happening on the ground, how are digital tools being used to see dissonance on the ground, for example. Whereas in MTI, we're really looking at, okay, what are some of the implications of inequality that we perhaps need to address? So, I'm happy to share more later, but I think I'll leave it to my esteemed colleagues, Joshua and Rushdi, to tell us a little bit about themselves first.
Great. Can I ask a quick follow-on question?
Sure.
So I'm curious as to, because I think the new team at MCI is of course just starting up. Maybe is there one takeaway from startup? This process of starting an institute, starting up a futures team within a kind of bureaucracy that kind of come, I don't know, apparent to you in this last few months?
Oh, so I think the one thing that I like in terms of being a startup is you can try anything and everything. Just go ahead. I think what I started doing was talking to a lot of people within the ministry to, sort of find out, where they were coming from, what are some of the issues that they're dealing with. And to be honest, because everybody was fairly curious about what Futures would do, how we would do it. Everybody was very, very forthcoming with sharing some of their ideas. So I think one tip is don't be afraid, just go out and just talk to people and ask them. I have no qualms about, looking silly in terms of asking the questions. And I think I'm pretty sure Joshua and Rushdi are laughing because like everybody sort of like knows, being a futurist means sometimes you've got to be the Cassandra in the room and, you've got to be a little bit, out there. And that's okay. And that's great. So I think in terms of starting out, don't be afraid to just go out there and like seek whatever you want to seek.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I think it's a trailblazing path in a trailblazing profession. So, that's interesting. So thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, we're going to quickly go on to Rushdi. So welcome, Rushdi. So wonderful to have you. We were just joking before that I only ever see Rushdi in countries that are not Singapore or Malaysia. So it's really wonderful to reconnect in this digital space today. So Rushdi is the Senior Vice President of the Malaysian Industry Government Group for High Technology, and he's been doing this work for quite some time. So he's got actually a really interesting range of different projects, foresight projects and initiatives that he's led that have really shaped Malaysia's national policy development over the last few years. So Rushdi, again, if you can introduce yourself, tell us a little bit more about what you do and what does institutionalizing foresight look like to you?
Yep. Whenever I'm asked to address a group of students, especially in Malaysia, I tell them that I have the most wonderful job where I'm supposed to dream about the future. But the fact is, I work for an organization, a think tank, a technology think tank, a public-private partnership, because the organization actually is the board members of the organization consist from captains of the industry as well as a representative from the government. So basically, we're a partnership think tank that is supposed to actually chart policy direction, provide policy advice to the government. Now, how do I get into this? Well, what happened was, as you know, the name MIGHT, you mentioned the name MIGHT, such a mouthful, Malaysian Industry Government Group for Higher Technology. We started as MIGHT. We started doing foresight since the 90s, the early 90s. But our focus was very much technology foresight. So, but in the year, I think in the early 2000s, the science advisor to the Prime Minister then, think that, the set of tools and methods are good. Why only concentrate on technology? And furthermore, realizing that technology cut across a lot of disciplines and things like that. So we've expanded. That is how my portfolio suddenly increased exponentially. I did future of consumers, future of youth, future of anti-corruption. So the scope has gone wide. Now, our idea of institutionalizing is not trying to create, because if you look up what that means, is actually, whether, you're trying to create an institution to do that. We already have the institution, one. But rather than the second definition, where we're trying to make it as a custom, where people do it as a practice. So the idea of any time that we want to do policies, we'll be thinking whether, how can we make this, I hate the word future proof, but how can we make it future ready rather than future proof? Because we can't proof it, we can't future proof it, but just make it future ready and try to think beyond what we normally think. So the set and the tools, methods, I think if you go through, if you've gone through learning from Cheryl, you'll understand, that there are just a number of tools out there. But our concern is that, so ever since we've done that, so as I said, a lot of policies, are now, foresight is embedded within them. if you read the document policies, you won't see, is this a foresight in action? But bear in mind, I have a lot of insider stories as the conversation when trying to come up with those policies. There are angles that was never thought about. Then suddenly we're bringing them in, and trying to there is I would say there is sugar coating, definitely. We're trying to ensure that it address political sensitivity, but the idea that some of these things are being talked about is fine. So my idea of institutionalizing foresight in public service does not necessarily mean you need to create a single entity and there are other one, because I don't think that's, to me, in Malaysian context, that's not the answer, but rather trying to make it that everybody embark on the same set of thinking wavelength in terms of trying to get futures thinking in what they're trying to do in policies. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think that's such an important point. And I think one of the things, even just hearing from the first two panelists, is that actually each country's context is different. Even between ministries, the context is different, right? And the first starting point is really to understand what that context is and the problems that you're trying to solve for the future. And in the absence of that, I mean, tools are just tools. They're not that hard to learn, and they're not that hard to apply, but context is everything, right? The next webinars that we will do is actually on measuring impact of foresight, which comes a little bit to Rushdi, your point about, actually as futures practitioners and as trying to institutionalize this process, actually some of it is, just influencing the strategic conversation in organizations, right? Which is such a intangible, difficult to measure impact. But I think for a lot of us, and we can come back to this point later, but for a lot of us who have been practitioners in this space, actually that's been so much of our levers, have been at influencing conversations at high levels, right? So that's a really interesting food for thought. Wonderful, thank you so much. Okay, can we, let's go on to Joshua, just a quick introduction and then we can talk a little bit more. So welcome Joshua, and thanks for joining us all the way from Europe. So Joshua is the Foresight lead of the OECD Observatory for Public Sector Innovation. So he's been involved in a lot of their strategic foresight work, and publications. And I think the interesting thing about your work, Joshua, is of course, working with dozens, not more than dozens, countries, different governments, different international organizations. So again, really interested to hear your take on what institutionalizing foresight in public service looks like. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me participate in this panel. So yes, I'm Josh Polchar. I'm the Foresight lead at the OECD Observatory of Public Sector Innovation. I've been at the OECD a bit longer than my time in this particular team, because I joined as part of the Secretary General's office, which has a strategic foresight unit there. And in my work there, I helped coordinate the government foresight community, which brings together dozens, as you say, Cheryl, of foresight practitioners from near on 30 different countries and international organizations, mostly people working for ministries and foresight units therein. I've also participated in the Oxford Scenarios program as a student and as a facilitator, and I helped to develop the Disruptive Futures program at EM Lyon Business School. So that's kind of the stripes that I'm earning for myself. Within the observatory at the OECD, we have work with a number of governments where we're doing direct collaborations to help upgrade strategic foresight capacity, demonstrate and implement strategic foresight practice. We have partners in Ireland, Finland, Slovenia, and several other countries. So the question on what does institutionalizing futures mean touches on very many aspects of the work that we do at OPSI. And indeed also the question of, is thinking about the future the responsibility of government? You opened with that, Cheryl. So my immediate answer to that is, we as foresight practitioners are not bringing the future to somewhere where it was absent, because people are always thinking about the future all the time. Governments are always thinking about the future all the time. The question is, are they doing it in a conscious and disciplined way, or are they doing something else? And of course, what happens with those thoughts and ideas about the future, whether disciplined or otherwise, is even more important, because our perception of the future determines what we do, what our actions are in the present, the policies that we make, the strategies that we devise, the lives that we change now and tomorrow. So bridging the impact gap between strategic foresight practice and present day action is really focal to the work that we're doing in the observatory. We are looking at ways to bridge the impact gap doing what we do best, which is, of course, innovation. So we're developing new ways of prototyping and experimenting for innovation using anticipatory processes. So hopefully we'll get the chance to talk a bit more about that during today's session.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I think that for me, observing the OECD's work has been an interesting evolution as well, right? Because it's kind of bridging this foresight practice with a innovation practice as well, because it's like, who do you throw the foresight work to, right? And actually the innovation capacity of the public service is actually a critical success factor to whether or not you can actually, kind of change that future narrative, right? So that's been really interesting. And I think maybe as a follow-on point, it will also be very interesting to see what are the other functions that get paired with foresight work when you institutionalize, this kind of work in governments, right? So I've been in teams where they pair it with an emergency planning function, or they pair it with a research function, or strategy function. That's quite common, design thinking function, that kind of thing. So that's also a really interesting way to see, from a setup perspective, how that works. Wonderful. I'm just going to remind everybody that, if you want to put any questions for the panelists, either as individuals or as a group, there is the Q&A function that's in the Zoom webinar. If not, we'll just rattle on and chat to each other, until the time runs out. But if you do want to get a question in or get some different perspectives, that would really be quite wonderful. Yeah. So maybe I'll pick up on something that Rushdi said, and I'll be curious to also get everybody's kind of view on it. So there is, I mean, maybe won't put it as a dilemma, but there is some choice in terms of like, institutionalizing a function. Does it look like like you're building futures literacy, across the public service? Is that one way of doing it? Or is it like you're building up a center of excellence somewhere? Am I putting it in too naively binary terms? And I'm curious as to maybe both Sharmini and Joshua, your views about where do we sit, in these two aspects. So, like for example, we've got quite a lot of people who are joining us from the Philippines Futures Thinking Society, who we do partner with, quite a lot, and then they've gone very much in the futures literacy space, right? That's kind of, and I mean, just the number of events and, kind of wonderful gatherings, large scale gatherings that they've been doing just in the year that they've been around has been really impressive. But that's a one strategy, right? So I'm curious as to, what are some of the other strategies you see? Maybe I start with Sharmini, if that's okay, and then I'll go to Joshua.
Sure.
And Rushdi, please feel free to chime in if you've got additional things as well. Sharmini.
Yeah. Hi, Cheryl. I just want to say I really like what you said about, futures being about having a conversation. And I think I'm actually curious to ask you, why did you term it institutionalizing futures? I mean, this particular session, because to me, it seems like the idea of institutionalizing it seems a little bit like there's a specific way, or there's a specific, there's certain steps in it. But actually, to be quite frank, it's very much, like you said, reading the context on the ground, having the conversations, seeding some ideas, talking to people and asking or facilitating questions and discussions in a way that people don't necessarily have the opportunity to come together to do. So I do have to say that, you know, in terms of, let's say, when I think about the work that I do, that I did in MTI, and then the work that I'm doing now, I wouldn't see it as, oh, there's a step-by-step way in which we're thinking about it. You know, it's more, what are some of the issues? How do we facilitate better conversations about it? How do we facilitate different conversations about it? And then what kind of tools and methods can we use to facilitate these different conversations? So I do have to share that, you know, one of the more successful workshops and things that I've done within the organizations has been, you know, just using a simple futures wheel and asking, actually it was quite cheeky, I asked the directors to do the work in terms of populating the wheel. But I do have to say that the feedback after that was, oh, this is wonderful, this is great. I never thought of using a tool like this to actually think about this particular issue in this way. So, you know, the whole idea of, let's say, institutionalizing it, I think is just about setting in place like a series of processes, a series of opportunities, perhaps a series of platforms through which people can come together and sort of talk through, discuss ideas, and then, you know, sort of think about it in a different way, you know, and have that external perspective come in rather than continuously being siloed within divisions. Because I think those of us who work in government would know divisions do tend to be siloed, right? And many of the issues that futures work tends to deal with tends to go across divisions. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, that's actually a good reflection point. I mean, the real answer is we chose institutionalizing because, you know, it's probably late on a Friday, we needed to think of a webinar title. So, you know, the reality of life and work, that was probably the real reason.
Right.
But, you know, I think it's, I think the phrase that Joshua used was, how do you do this in a conscious and disciplined way, right?
Yeah.
So I think that really comes to a little bit closer to the core of the discussion that we're trying to have. But yeah, absolutely, that distinction is important, right? But yeah, thanks so much for
No. I mean, yeah. To be fair, I mean, to your point, I think in MTI it's definitely a little bit more starting up, and then like in MTI it was definitely more institutionalizing it a little bit more because MTI did have a background and history with it. So yeah, no, I was just curious.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think yeah, so some I think this is Noel, right? If I'm not wrong. Yeah, so just sharing a little bit about what's happening in the Philippine Senate, you know, so they've started to have standing committees, you know, so that's what I think, Sharmini, what you're saying, like platforms, what are these different ways, you know, bureaucrats are quite good at putting up meeting agendas when there's a meeting coming up. So, you know, maybe that's also using that to our advantage to kind of get this work more in a more conscious and disciplined way. That's fantastic. Okay, Joshua.
Yeah, I also picked up on the word institutionalizing as I was reflecting on this webinar in my preparation for it. And the thing, yeah, here's the thing about institutionalizing is that it does have multiple meanings when we use it in English, because it can mean mainstreaming. And I think that's the sense that you had in mind when you created the webinar. And we are also doing work on that at the OECD. We had a report out in 2019 presented to the Summit of Centres of Governments about, it was called Strategic Foresight for Better Policies. And in our work with Ireland, we've been looking at different ways in which governments can mainstream and indeed institutionalize strategic foresight. And I'll be happy to pick up. I see one of the questions that we already have coming in was, what are the top 3 things we would recommend countries should do to embed foresight practice into the public service? You give me a chance in a moment, I'll give you 5. But just back to this question, capacity and practice are like 2 sides of the same coin, right? You can't have one without the other. And we've found in our discussions with multiple countries that if strategic foresight is no one's responsibility, then you're reliant on people who are enthusiastic and taking initiative and maybe who have a futures background to really stick their neck out and take the risk of doing work that may go against the grain of the institution that they're working in. So it is important to have an authorizing environment which favors the practice of strategic foresight within an institution. On the other hand, that also has to be done right, because it's a risk to name someone as head of foresight or create a foresight unit without a proper appreciation of the skills and capacity needed for them to actually carry out that task. There's a bit of a Dunning-Kruger effect, you know, where people tend to underestimate the amount of experience needed to do strategic foresight. That's not to put anyone off, but it's also to make sure that to make sure that institutions don't get out of their depth too quickly in developing this practice. And indeed that people like ourselves are around to help and support.
Great. I like what you said about the Dunning-Kruger effect, because I think that's definitely something that speaks to me a lot. And maybe one way of thinking about this word institutionalizing is also, is there a way that we can get maybe not 100% repeatable results, but like consistently good quality foresight work out, right? Like, you know, and what's that system level, you know, support that is needed so that, as you say, right, individuals, you know, enthusiastic individuals are not beaten down by the system, you know, because there's a, you know, lack of a authorizing environment, right? Yeah, so interesting. Rushdi, I see you just unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I you know, one of the first thing we did when we were, because one of the tasks that was given to me when I head the Foresight unit within MITE was actually to mainstream Foresight within the government. You know, so one of the first thing we do was actually to do the futures thinking in government. So you know, put it into practice, yes. You know, and straight away, you know, come up with certain strategies and solutions and things like that. So we explore definitely options with regards to, you know, whether we want to create a specific unit under the Prime Minister's department and things like that, or, you know, and those are some of the things that we explored definitely. But, you know, we decided to go the other way in terms of trying to, you know, embed this within the thinking, the psyche, the mindset of the public service, that, you know, whenever a project that comes in, you know, they will be more inclined to work together rather than, you know, outsource this to a specific unit, you know. Okay, since Foresight is a responsibility of this particular unit within, so let them do it. So, you know, one of the first thing we did was actually develop modules and you know, I'm sure you know of Intan, our public service training institute. One of the things first thing we did was actually do that, you know, develop these modules and things like that, and work with the public service department, trying to come up with so-called future of public service. So the idea is to go that way. So and then, you know, since the training institute is where the seedings of ideas and things, so it gets spread out. I think in our case, I'm not saying in other people's case, in our case faster, whereby, you know, people go through that training institute and come out and, you know, okay, there's this foresight and futures thinking that we need to, you know, at least explore in terms of trying to come up with policy. But I'll just like to bring back, you know, I think you're aware that there is a report commissioned by the UK government in terms of effective systemic foresight. You know, again, that is a report that looks at, you know, 8 countries and, you know, what works, what not work, and such things. So you know, I guess I will say that there is no silver bullet here. You know, what works in one country, I think Joshua could attest to this. What works in one country, even within the OECD, might not necessarily work in another country within the OECD. And you know, and the same principle applies here, even at country level, even in ministry. I think, Cheryl, we've been visited by a lot of countries trying to look, you know, I think whenever a country comes to Malaysia, they'll be saying, you know, their next stop is going to be Singapore, or they've been to Singapore and their next stop is us, and, you know, they're trying to set up, you know, how can they build a better foresight capacity in their country. So as I said, again, we're sharing, but we're not prescribing. I don't think we're prescribing anything in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that for me actually was one of the kind of big insights moving from a practitioner within the Singapore government into the academic space, where, you know, now we are teaching international classes, you know, and international practitioners, and really forced me to think actually what works in Singapore because of the Singapore context, and what is actually, objectively a good practice, if that makes sense. Actually, so much of it is that context, and as I mentioned, even within ministries, and the culture of even within ministries can be vastly different across them. So that's also interesting. Thanks so much, Andrew, for sharing, the Go Science report. So that's the Foresight project that Rushdi mentioned, and if any of you are interested, you can see some of the features of effective systemic foresight in governments around the world. Yeah, so weekend homework reading for everyone. Wonderful. Yeah, I think one of the questions that I was hoping to kind of come back to, and I think we've talked about these in various ways, right? But so there are quite a number of questions which basically come down to like, what are enabling factors? What are top 3 things you would recommend? And even though we're trying to resist, this like overgeneralization, maybe we could go around and just hear from everyone, but at least within your context, and if you could be a bit transparent about what that context is, what has worked, that would be really great to hear from all of you. Yeah. Again, maybe I'll start with Sharmini, if that's okay.
Sure. Okay, so I think what has worked definitely is in terms of starting the team within MCI is really to start with small wins first. And so for us, that would mean actually sending round summaries with some kind of policy questions attached. Some of these gained traction within the institution. Directors that we sent it to came back with some feedback and said, hey, this is interesting, or like, what do you think about this? Or no, I think, there was some discussion over email. So that was useful. The second thing I would say is useful is to bring together a diverse team. So in MTI, the team that I was in, we were the strategic planning function, which means that we sought input from many divisions in order to do the foresight work. Whereas in MCI, the team is actually made up of individuals from across divisions. And so they bring with them a significant wealth of knowledge, and which we then integrate into our futures products. We do work closely with our friends in our statutory boards as well. So always trying to get that external perspective, and we're always trying to also bring in perspectives from people whom we meet, from international experts. So I think what also works is bringing in that international lens, because I think sometimes when you're in the day-to-day of the ministry work, it's very easy to lose yourself in, okay, this is what's happening, and this is the domestic concern, but to totally forget what are some of the long-term background issues that are actually festering. And so sometimes I think all of us, we do need reminders by talking to people outside of our community, to sort of push us to think about things very, very differently. And I don't mean experts as in just, experts or academics, I mean people, bloggers, right? People on the ground. I've had the great opportunity to be part of something called Emerging Stronger Together Conversations. That was something that was held by our Prime Minister's office last year. And had the wonderful opportunity to meet Singaporeans from all parts of life, all industries, who were just so passionate about contributing ideas, about Singapore policy or what would work, from inclusive societies. How do you, incorporate inclusive societies? What does it mean to be an inclusive society? What does emerging stronger together actually mean to Singaporeans from different walks of life? So I think Futures gives you that opportunity to engage with this wide variety of people. And I think it's just so important. It just brings such rich conversations to the table. It just brings a wealth of opportunity for you to explore. So to me, in terms of what works, that's something that definitely works. Bringing in the external perspective, which, your bosses don't necessarily always have the time to see. Bringing in diverse perspectives from your team, bringing in diverse perspectives from people of all ages, genders, inclinations. Yeah, sorry, I could go wax lyrical about this forever, Cheryl, because I'm so like so I do have to say to everybody who's joining us, I was a teacher in my former life. I was an educator teaching A-level geography before I discovered this wonderful world of futures, and I was like, what? I get to learn about all these things and be paid for it? But, you know, I think it's just very naturally to just sort of really to bring people together, to sort of bring that understanding. So I think what works is also not going in and saying, hey, I'm a futures person and I'm here to tell you what you're not seeing. You know, I don't think that the approach really works. I think what is important is that we all share that we're in the same boat together, you know, so approaching the conversation with kindness, with an understanding that not everybody sort of like tuned into the things that you're reading, that not everybody's going to be understanding what you're saying at that point in time, you know, and just being okay with that. So it does require a little bit of resilience on everybody's part. But anyway, sorry, in a nutshell, that's to me some institutional practices of what works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to be able to hold that space for conversations, you know, and you know, a lot of potentially very difficult conversations, right, about the future, I think is as a practice very not that easy a practice to you know, kind of invoke in large bureaucratic organizations, right? So it's a real gift that you give to the system as well, right? You know, we often talk about like who owns the future, you know, and is it and to have, you know, to understand that actually it's a much more diverse group, right? And that it belongs to so many different people, you know, and we need to be sensitive to that. Yeah. But thank you so much for sharing. Joshua, is this the time where you go and give us your 5?
Oh, I can't wait. Yeah,
do it.
Well, first of all, I'd like to chime off what Sharmini was saying, because I really couldn't agree more. And at the risk of repeating her points, just to underline how much I agree with them, I would say, yes, definitely collaboration with experts in other domains is absolutely fundamental to effective strategic foresight practice. It's also important as part of our humbleness, recognizing that before the future, we are all ignorant, and all we can do is change our ways of thinking and expand the frame of what we consider relevant. And again, that also involves bringing in experts from multiple domains. And indeed, at the OECD, we're very privileged to have multiple directorates with experienced experts in the domains that are particularly relevant to the governments that we're working with, in order to enrich the strategic foresight practice that we're doing. So we've found that really beneficial, and we can say that that is one of the things that has worked really well when we intervene in countries, doing it hand in hand with colleagues from elsewhere in the OECD, as well as experts who understand the local context within a particular government. It was Rushdi who said, things don't work the same in any particular context, and you can't assume that what worked in one place will automatically work in another. So it's also important to bring in local knowledge from people who are going to be implementing the results and the actions derived from strategic foresight work. Also agree on quick wins. One of the other points from Sharmini, it's really worked for us just to do short interventions. Of course, strategic foresight is something that you need to do in the long haul. It takes many months, many years of constant chipping away in order to really reap the benefits of strategic foresight practice. That said, in just a day, we have been able to go into a particular Ministry of Education, or even in one of the directorates within the OECD, to look at their own internal corporate strategy, develop a set of plausible alternative futures, call them scenarios if you like, come up with some potential actions, and have those kind of anchored in people's minds to take forward. And that kind of sows the seed of futures thinking that we want to leave people with, and hopefully that grows in the long term. But of course, it's even better if you keep coming back and watering the seed that you've planted. And then what I'd really like to underline is purpose. What works is people understanding why you're doing strategic foresight practice. You're not just coming in there to have a nice or entertaining conversation that you might have over a drink with a friend in the evening about what's going on in the world. You're going there because a particular organization has a particular set of needs and faces a particular set of circumstances that it wants to better understand, have a better reading of, and perform and succeed in the future. That's why we're doing what we're doing. That's what motivates us to be strategic foresight practitioners. So establishing that purpose right at the beginning, before you even start thinking about the future, is fundamental to what works and to the success of the practice. And then keep going back to it throughout the process. And that's something that's really worked, particularly in an intervention we're doing with Slovenia on the future of public service. We established our purpose at the beginning, but we kept recalling it throughout the process. So participants who were involved in designing, developing the scenarios and coming up with innovations to act upon what we found, felt that sense of purpose and always knew why we were doing what we were doing. So the top 5 things that I've kept you waiting for are demand, so making and that links into purpose, capacity to do the strategic foresight work and having futures experts around to guide the process, institutions, which is kind of the topic of our conversation here, embeddedness and feedback and communication, so that you can learn from past successes, or indeed things that you learned the hard way that didn't go how you had originally hoped. So those are the things that I'd underline, and we go through those one by one in a report that we recently published, commissioned by the government of Ireland, which I'll share in the chat for those who are interested to read more.
Yeah, fantastic. I've always found these 5 such a wonderful, I will declare that I assigned that as reading in my class. But it's such a wonderful framework, yeah, to also help us understand. Yeah, I think what I really liked about what you said was also how purpose links to the present action, right? Because I think that maybe that's one distinction of doing this work within a public sector organization, is that ultimately there are still decision makers that need to make decisions, right? As opposed
Absolutely.
to being, like a more academic institution where, it's for the intellectual curiosity of exploring what the future would look like. But I think in the public service in particular, right, we actually have this obligation, I would say, because we do have actually very powerful levers, and to not use those levers wisely, for the future, I think is a disservice to society, right? So I think that's a distinction. I think that your remarks brought up in my head. Yeah.
And if I may, we have another question in the written questions from someone who said, how far ahead do we need to be looking into the future? And that is fully answered by the question of what is your purpose? So answer a question with a question. It depends on how much of the future matters to you here in your present. So if you're working in tech, for example, things change very quickly, and you might not even be able to imagine how things are going to look in tech 50 years from now. But if you're working for a forestry commission where trees take a long time to grow, then things are on a much slower time scale. So how far ahead do you think about the future? Depends entirely on what is your purpose for acting in the present.
Yeah, it's fantastic, so important. Rushdi, over to you.
Well, I think based on what Joshua said, in my line of work, we said, you need to scope it, because the future is so huge. I see a question on Future Real there. Even then, the scope of Future Real was actually to chart the industry development, local industry development of things. But one of the things that I'd like to touch with regards to building capacity, foresight capacity within public service, due to the fact that public service needs to provide policies, build policies, and create this capacity to anticipate the future. Now, in my line of work, again, I think I've spoken this during the OECD meeting of Foresight in government, as well as in Asian Foresight Alliance organized by ASEAN. Then in terms of the Asia Pacific Futures Network, Futurist Network, and we've talked about this. As a start, we're trying to build the capacity to undertake foresight, to do foresight. At present, but certain countries have gone further. Willingness to accept, listen to this foresight evidence for So capacity to anticipate does not equals into ability to act. COVID is a clear case, where people actually anticipate this quite a number of years prior to this. But the willingness to act, because there is a lot of, if you're doing foresight, then you should understand that there's a lot of variables, drivers, levers that is in play. So but to be dismissive of foresight capacity at a start, I think is truly wrong. But however, this is something that I spoke at our public service institution, training institute. It is, because at the time they were doing this blue ocean strategy training, and I was invited as a speaker. So I presented on foresight and things like that. And at the time, the chief secretary was like it, and he said, let's embed this into public service. And some of the participants will say, oh, RIP blue ocean strategy. But my take on this is, this is not the definitive solution for public service, but it is one of the key tools and methods that you can embed within public service. So I think what we're trying to do is trying to create a better public service, so that they could plan and do stuff that is expected of them. And I'll just like to respond also with regards to the question somebody was asking with regards to international, embedding this with the international, within the realm of foreign policy. I think the IDFR has done a number of engagement on foresight on foreign policy. So I think they are there, because I think in IDFR they've talked about creating a VNet scenario, whereby there's already scenarios that's being created elsewhere in terms of what's happening. And in fact, I had a conversation with my colleague from Singapore, with regards to some of these scenarios is very much US or China centric, and what will be the context within Malaysia foreign relations. So there are already work that's being done there in that space.
Cheryl, sorry if I could just add on.
Of course, yes, please.
I just wanted to share that I think whenever people hear that you're doing futures work or you're doing foresight work, they have certain visions in their head of what that means. So, and I don't think my family knows what I do still. But anyway, I was going to say that I think part of our role then in terms of institutionalizing it is actually to demystify the term and to demystify what it entails. And to share that actually everybody has a role to play in it. Futures really is for everyone. So I've met some colleagues who flat out just told me, oh, futures, I don't believe in it. And I find these people the best people to talk to, because they're absolutely engaging, and they always give me a wonderful sounding board for my ideas, because then I'll know whether it's too crazy or just the right amount of crazy based on their response. So I think it's also about building up that network of support within the organization. Who is somebody that you can count on to actually share in that joy and share in that excitement with you in sharing and spreading that message. And part of the way in which we do that is also when we do our products, we also consult our divisions along the way. So our divisions do have a stake in the final product before it goes up to the permanent secretaries to be discussed, for example. And when I say futures really is for everyone, in MCI, we do have like brown bag sessions with our minister where we just, have different topics for discussion. And we've shared our interns' work. Our interns have gone up to present to the minister, what they're seeing on the ground in terms of, let's say, the disinformation landscape, or, what they're seeing on the ground in terms of identity politics. And we find that this brings a very refreshing lens to some of the issues that we are looking at, because here you have, students on the ground who are dealing with these issues or experiencing these issues in real time and bringing it, to everybody's knowledge. So yeah, I just wanted to share, demystifying it is part and parcel of that institutionalizing work. And I think it's actually probably the most important thing that you might need to do right from the beginning. When I first started, I was like, what is this futures? It sounds wonderful. I'm so excited by it. No idea how to do it. But, as I got familiar with the tools and the ideas, I was like, okay, really, we need to look ahead. We need to look ahead in terms of the issues, in terms of the policies, how robust our policies are, and how are we best able to do that? Who do we bring in to help us understand this space a little more?
Yeah, I think one other part of the demystifying is also demystifying what the horizon looks like, right? What this future horizon and the weak signals that we're seeing. Because I think one challenge is also that, when we're having these future-oriented conversations, actually we are not talking about the same thing at all. And I've experienced that a lot in projects where, let's say, you're talking about something like Industry 4.0, which is, become such a throwaway term that actually, 6 people in the room, well, they have 6 different ideas of what they're talking about, and actually nobody really knows what they're talking about. So things like that, I think, again, for practitioners within the public service is an important function to be able to hold that space. And I think Joshua made this comment to say that actually everybody, it's not like we come and there's a vacuum, right? Everybody already has their own worldview about what the future is and what it holds. But is that the what if we were wrong question, right? And that's the risk that we're trying to protect from. Yeah.
Well, if I may, it goes back to there was a question also with regards to we're trying to in terms of trying to demystifying this, that we're predicting things or forecasting things. I think the word I used last time was we're trying to instigate the future. But now we're saying we're exploring the future. But the idea is actually we're looking that there are multiple possibilities and trying to see what makes sense of the future. I think the word sense making has been thrown a lot in terms of trying to do foresight and futures work. And that's what we're trying to do actually, rather than the term. That's why I think I told Cheryl previously, the word futurist, I think the word is quite misleading. I prefer the word foresight practitioner rather than futurist, but unfortunately where this term keeps coming back to describe people like us, so
Yeah, absolutely. I see, Joshua, that you've tagged some questions that you would like to answer live. Would you want to give moderator privilege to you? Would you like to pick the next one?
Yeah, sure. Well, actually, my next thing was to bounce off a bit what the other panelists have said, because I think it is really important to demystify the future, but demystifying should not mean dumbing it down and should not mean appeasing people's intuition about the future, which is misleading. The future is counterintuitive, and the way that we practice it in strategic foresight is counterintuitive, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. We don't dumb down the fact that the Earth is round just because it intuitively feels flat to a lot of people, and you wouldn't know that unless you were told it. So likewise, we shouldn't appease the sense that the future is out there somewhere else waiting to be discovered, or something that we can put off until later. The future is nowhere special. It's an illusion. It's a convenient fiction that we create, or a set of convenient fictions that we create for ourselves in order to have a guide on how to act. So what matters is what we make of the future and how we act upon it. And what we make of the future depends on our worldview, our assumptions, how broad our frame of analysis is. And in strategic foresight, we're all about broadening that frame of analysis, challenging the assumptions, questioning worldviews. And in terms of how we act on it as well, it's our strategic capacity, how much we're willing to experiment, how open we are to new ideas and new alternatives to explore. So demystifying the future, absolutely yes, but that should mean bringing people along on our journey as strategic foresight practitioners and people who are always discovering the future as it emerges all around us, not waiting for some mythical future to arrive.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. I'm going to shift the questions a little bit. So I think Wendy McGuinness from New Zealand has asked a question around combining public, private, and academic strengths. I've got a very big vested interest in this question. But we've been talking a lot about institutionalizing within the public sector, but let's talk about the non-state actors, and other people, right? How can we work better together? How do we combine, our different strengths to optimize foresight capacity at a national level? I'd be curious to hear everyone's views. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Rushdi, there you go.
Yeah,
it's like a game of chicken.
Let me go. Well, it depends on the context, subject matter, sectors. So I think whenever we embark on a foresight projects, I would say projects of foresight. What we do is we do a stakeholders analysis. We always undertake from the very beginning with regards to this stakeholders analysis in terms of power interest grid, what we call a power interest grid. So you slot people, organizations, individuals. Some individuals, we put NGOs. A lot of interest but very small power. Some government agencies are very high power but very low interest. So you balance it out, and you're trying to get balanced viewpoints from all these people. So I think it depends on context, subject matter, and again purpose of that. Where is it? Because what I do in my line of work, whenever I try to embark on a foresight, there needs to be a home for it, to ensure that that there is an uptake. We call it sponsors or champion, whatever you might, because at the end of the day, those sets of recommendations from this exhaustive exercise needs to go somewhere. Now somebody needs to implement it. So then there needs a home. So I think in terms of scoping the futures is very important early on. There's so many, I think, well-intended foresight work that simply are left hanging out there, not necessarily just in Malaysia, but I've been involved with certain things. When I ask the question, where does this go to? This just in the realm of we're just happily trying to get together and create something. But as I said, if in the realm of public service, I think the early buy-in, scoping needs to come into play, and to answer those questions. And of course, depending on the subject matter, definitely we're going to bring everybody in based on the power interest rate. That's how I approach it.
Wonderful. Maybe Sharmini?
Sure. I saw a question earlier about COVID-19, so maybe we could merge these ideas together. I'll respond to merge these ideas together. I think there's definitely scope for everybody, public, private, to work together. And I think COVID-19 was a seminal year in which I think everybody figured that they had to work together in order to figure out what was happening. Because right at the start of the crisis, I think everybody was sort of thrown off by the speed at which it was happening. Things were very, very murky and unclear. And I do remember being asked as well, how do you do futures in an environment with such uncertainty? The great thing is then in that kind of environment, things become a lot more plausible when you suggest them. And I think in that kind of an environment, bringing people into the conversation at that juncture to try and figure out what does it mean for economy, what does it mean for society, and I think, asking the right questions. So what's the worst case scenario? what will we not be able to recover from? These are important things that need to be considered. I think the Emerging Stronger Task Force, Singapore actually went ahead and set up a task force, actually came up with a report that incorporated insights from industry as well as government, as well as members of the public as to how we could emerge from the crisis better and stronger together. And to me, that it's definitely doable. I don't think we exist in different realms or in different spaces. But yeah, I think I agree with Rushdi, depending on the context. I just thought COVID-19 was just an excellent way. I mean, it was an excellent platform through which everybody could come together and do something. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Josh?
Yeah, I'll pick up on the big C as well. So the time to do futures about COVID was when it was still in the future. And then all of a sudden, COVID was not in the future anymore. And suddenly everyone in the whole wide world wanted to come and start doing futures of COVID, which is, I say it in a bit of a glib way, but it is an irony. And it does serve as a useful lesson. And it's unfortunate, but it's the case in a lot of institutions that people come to strategic foresight after they realize they could have really benefited from it. So that's something that we have to live with, but it does fuel demand for our profession. So, we can benefit from the uptick of it. And it serves as a useful lesson for us to bring to our interventions. People coming to our practice for the first time often try to use probability as a way of determining how much attention we should give to a particular idea or signal of the future. And strategic foresight practice, one of our fundamental tenets is that we dismiss the use of probability as a way to determine the proportion of our attention that goes to particular ideas. So it's very useful to draw people's attention to the fact that improbable things happen quite often. And if you live long enough, a large number of improbable things are probably going to occur. And that's the irony of it. So we often start our interventions by asking people, what is something that has happened in the last year that you would have considered highly improbable just 2 years ago? And of course, there's always a great big long list of things. It's very easy to do that. And then we change the question and make it about the future. So why would it be any different when we're looking from today's perspective for a whole load of very improbable things to happen over the coming year?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this has come up in other panels that we've done as well, but it's this, definitely COVID has increased the demand for the profession, and it's much easier to convince people that improbable things are going to happen. But I think it's really, I don't know whether you feel the same way, but it's really strengthened this distinction that I think Rushdi talked about, which was, at the end of the day, the ability to anticipate is not the same as the willingness to act. Right. And I think it's kind of forced us to kind of take a little bit more of a cold, hard look at our willingness to act. Right. And that might be a willingness to take risks, to, invest when we're not sure, and how do you do these things in an uncertain environment? I mean, that's the future's question. Right. So I think that for me is how some of these conversations has shifted. I think for us, at the LKY school, coming in, to futures and public policy work, but from an academic and a university lens, I guess one role that we can play is in capability development, so whether that's in training, skills development. I mean, we are in the teaching business, so that's easier for us to do. I would love to think that we are a container for cool content and insights, maybe easier for universities to kind of bring a slightly contentious group of people together, to kind of trash out ideas in a somewhat safe space. I think I would love to see that, that universities play that role as well. And we're used to alumni and networks. I would love to see that we are also a place that brings community together, right? And across different disciplines and points of view. So that would, in my ideal world, would definitely be the kinds of roles that I think I would love to see us play. in this contributing to national foresight landscapes, right? International foresight landscape as well.
I just like to continue on those threads. I'm not saying that capacity building. There needs to be capacity building because without capacity building, that means if you apply the Johari windows, unknown. So now at least we know that what's unknown out there or the risk. So at least we know that we have already anticipated this, and it's just a matter of whether we're willing to take the risk and act upon it and things like that. So I'm not to discourage people. So let's not learn foresight because at the end of the day we're not gonna act on things. Whenever I give a talk in Malaysia, because there was a particular, although we're not in the business of predicting, there was a particular scenario that we've developed in 2010 about Malaysia 2020. And if you're a Malaysian, if you look through that scenario, you realize that it described the situation in 2020 almost to a T. And what happened because of that particular scenario, a certain policy decision was made at the time with regards to national budget for R&D and things like that. And this goes back to impact. In the hindsight, that foresight actually demonstrate the effectiveness of that policy because we did not act on certain things because based on that particular scenario that was developed. But that measurement matrix, we need to wait 10 years after the policy has enacted, then we can see that how things works. So although we're not predicting, but sometimes some of these scenarios of exploration of the future, best fruition. So I would think that a foresight work done well would actually contribute towards better policies. I truly believe that. And these are some of the case studies in Malaysian context that I share with Malaysians because they would reading that snapshot narrative of those scenarios is just a pager, but you understand what it does and what it says.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's one of the gifts of some of us doing foresight for quite a while, right? Is that actually you do have the ability to take a look, and at actually how has that conversation shifted, right? Has it shifted, and yeah, whether that again, helps that mainstreaming and institutionalizing process. Yeah, I'm conscious that we are going to run out of time, so I'm going to take this as a maybe we'll do the final question for all the panelists. We've talked a lot about actually what works, but maybe now we should talk about what doesn't work. And actually, what are some examples of, where it would be a pretty bad idea to institutionalize foresight in the public service, right? Are there other use cases which don't work? I'm curious as well. So yeah, barriers in the way of effective, impactful foresight practice within institutions, I think. Is maybe that's how we should close our discussion today, if that's okay. Shall I start with you, Joshua?
Sure. Yeah. So I can talk about barriers in terms of competency. We've already touched on that a little bit earlier. And also people who think they've got the future all figured out, because it's pretty difficult to bring a kind of challenging and reframing mindset to people who are convinced that they don't need it. There can also be cultural barriers in terms of unreasonable expectations that some oracle of strategic foresight is going to come in and reveal the future. We have an expert on the future here who's going to come in and tell us everything we need to do. Yeah, we have to disappoint people who have that expectation and maybe surprise them pleasantly with what we are able to bring to the table. Then we have all kinds of cognitive and corporate barriers, things like we talk about institutional silos of subject matter, but also there are time silos, which might take the form of electoral cycles, policy cycles, and so on, or particular planning periods. difficulty recognizing complexity, avoidance of uncertainty, but also avoidance of taking risk. And anticipatory innovation often means bringing something new or novel to a context that you can face blowback and negative consequences for if you champion it. There are often kind of official zombie futures within organizations that are taken as the final word on what's going to happen in the future, and it's very difficult to unseat those and challenge them. And indeed, when there is feedback from the present that your version of the future might not be very useful as a guide on how to act, a lot of organizations miss those signals. So having those kind of learning loops and antennas out there is often a bit of a barrier. And then lastly, there are the communication barriers. So the people who just haven't had it explained to them, or the people who are convinced that their intuition is the right one. So voila, a whole set of barriers that we face. It just makes the challenge that more energizing, and it means that we always have more work to do.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Sharmini, over to you.
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up on Joshua's last point, because I think the barrier would definitely be the communications bit. Really knowing your audience, the context, the time they have, the platforms that they are used to, and the language that they speak. It's not something that's a sensibility that's open to everybody. It's really about knowing the people that you're going to engage and presenting that information to them in a way that makes sense, that allows them to join the dots. In a way that gives them a different kind of picture. So I think it's just making sometimes the thinking obvious, is important. And to me, that's always about, that's self-reflexivity. Sometimes, I think everybody knows what I know, but actually, my boss keeps telling me, yeah, you might know, but not everybody does. So, tell me exactly, spell it out for me. So I think, that is an institutional barrier, of course, in terms of receptivity to the work. But I think internally, I think we also do need some kind of self-reflection to understand that where we are coming from, our own positionality is also equally a barrier at times.
No, that's so, that's a very self-aware comment, and it's, future teams have biases too, right? And then, that's so true. Rushdi?
Well, I think when will it not work? I think when you're thinking that it's exclusive. That means it's exclusive domain. If you're doing futures in this particular, so it's exclusively you. So that Foresight Center is doing that. So I think that won't work, because the idea, I think Sharmini and Joshua keep harping the point that there needs to be a collaboration and exchanges. So to say that Foresight in a particular sector or industry is very much their domain, and let's not touch on that, because you need to understand, in the realm of Foresight, one of the competencies that we stress is actually ability to connect the dots, and the dots might be in another ministry. So that is one. The second, I think we've talked about this a lot as well, whereby Foresight people in government do not, are too busy doing something else rather than doing Foresight. So the ability to effectively do Foresight, is compromised. So you might have a term, a Foresight unit somewhere, but at the end of the day, they are just doing typical administrative work. So I think that doesn't work as well. So that's just the two that I think, since you're being cheeky about this,
Wonderful, and thanks so much for sharing all those insights. I think that's the real practitioner, real talk, right? Everything looks great on a slide and in a marketing brochure, but real talk, actually there are some of these very real challenges, and I do want to pick up especially on the communication and engagement part, right? Because you can be this Foresight unit stuck in a corner somewhere that just wants to throw Foresight products over the fence to some hapless policymaker somewhere else, you know. But actually, how do you engage them in this process early on, right? So that's also a conversation between them. It's not so easy. And I remember one conversation I had when I was still working in government to say that actually, if I spend 1 hour doing the futures research, you know, that Rushdi was talking about, then actually I should spend another hour in engagement, right? Which has severe implications on my performance appraisal, you know. So again, you know, it's like, what do we do, right? As systems, you know, how do we support this so we don't, you know, have, you know, your enthusiastic policy officers hit on the chopping board, right? You know, and don't rely on them to carry, you know, this burden of you know, thinking about the future and thinking about policy options for the future. Yeah. So thank you very much to Sharmini, Joshua, Rushdi. You know, it's been such a wonderful, delightful conversation, you know, and wide-ranging. And I think for me, even I've learned so much from your individual experiences as well. If I can invite the audience, if you've got one key takeaway, you know, from what you've heard today, and you could put that into the chat, I think it would be a lovely gift for our 3 panelists who have spent, you know, this evening with us to share their insights. So if you could do that, maybe one key takeaway that you got out of this conversation, one thing that, you know, surprised you, delighted you, you know, that we would really love to hear that. We'd also love feedback. So before we end off, as I mentioned, this is a webinar series that we're doing. So the feedback is very valuable to us, and it's helped us over the last few sessions also hone the kind of topics and the kind of conversations we want to have. So please let us know, you know, what you thought. If I can have the next slide. We do have a next webinar. This will be season 1 finale. You know, so the 5th one of this season for the year. We are taking a break in December, so that's not going to happen. But you know, it's going to be on measuring the impact of foresight work in public policy. There were some questions around that that we didn't quite manage to get to, and I hope that we'll be able to continue that conversation in the next round. So if you can join us in October, that's going to be what we talk about. You know, impact, measuring the impact. What does that look like? Maybe next slide. So the Executive Education Department does run executive education programs. And we do have 2 on futures that are coming up, and we do have early bird discount. So if you are Singapore-based, you know, please join us in September for a program on futures for public policy. I think we're focusing on the future of work as the topic. You know, and we are dying to go back into the classroom. You would not believe. As you can see, I'm in my office, you know, so if you are Singapore-based and would like to join us, please sign up before the 31st, and we'll be able to extend that early bird discount to you. If you're not Singapore-based, or for whatever reason you would like to do an online program instead, we also do a Futures Masterclass where we encourage people to sign up as teams. And many of you are actually Future Masterclass alumni, so it's so wonderful to see all of you back. And then other programs, Leading for Innovation and Negotiation Strategies for Success. You know, these are done by my co-director, Francesco Mancini. You know, so wide range of things. You know, we're in the capability development business, as we said. And if any of these interest you, do look forward to seeing you in the classroom, either virtually or physically. And my very last slide. Please keep in touch. We are super active on LinkedIn as a department, so please connect with us with that QR code. And if you're looking to collaborate on futures work, you can email us at lkysppfutures@nus.edu.sg. And more generally, open enrollment programs at lkyspp.oe@NUS. Okay, that was the big spiel. So that leaves me to say, thank you very much. Thank you again to our 3 panelists. Such a delightful conversation, and I do hope that you also got something, you know, out of this you know, wide-ranging, I would say, you know, an insightful session. You know, do look forward to seeing, especially Rushdi and Joshua in person at some point. You know, hopefully in the new, you know, in the near future, and that'd be wonderful. And to everybody who's attended from all over the world, again, thank you so much for your support and being part of this conversation and your really great questions. I do wish you an enjoyable rest of your day. Yeah, think about how to institutionalize futures work in the public sector. Okay, thank you very much. And that's all from us.